and we'll see what happens. Diction, he defines as when words are arranged and selected in such a way, and he should say chosen, and arranged and selected, that means chosen, in such a way that their meaning arouses the aesthetic imagination. When that happens, the result may be described as poetic diction. So, when I'm talking about this, or when you look at this as a topic, Barfield is actually talking about perception and how imagination itself, how thought emerged out of the world of things. You know, back in the day isn't even a sufficient way to describe the way he starts his thesis. He's talking about when sort of at the birth of consciousness, and so that's the way I'm going to talk about it in this most compelling lecture that I've prepared. Okay, so when words are arranged and selected in such a way their meaning arouses the aesthetic imagination. So the aesthetic imagination is aesthetic when it produces excitement and a feeling of excitement just by being activated. It doesn't have to, just as soon as it kicks in, it produces pleasure. That's the aesthetic imagination. You might have a different kind of imagination where you're imagining what's going to happen if you don't pay your electric bill and stuff like that, or what's going to happen to your kids if they don't grow up, or whatever, but that's not the kind we're talking about. Aesthetic imagination makes us happy just by starting to work. And when this happens, and we engage in it, the result is a so-called felt change of consciousness. We have a felt change of consciousness. Felt, as in you feel it, not as in roofing felt. Okay.
Clarity is always.
This is really going to be good to watch Fromm on this talk. Scratching his head. Okay. This happens when we read a poem we love or a great piece of prose fiction as well. We enter the voice of the writer, or it enters us, and it makes us feel something very large. And when we get that feeling, that's the aesthetic imagination. Now, Barfield makes a distinction between making a poem or a piece of fiction. And I'm using them interchangeably. And I throw in creative nonfiction when it's really cooking, too. So when you're making literature, okay, that is great, or, you know, we could even say hella good. There's a distinction between making it and appreciating it. And when we appreciate it, it's like we've all been places where, you know, you're with your friends and you go, hey, you got to listen to this. You know the Tri-Works in Moby Dick, where they're cooking the blubber, the 3 harpooneers are standing on a deck and they've got the whale, and it's nighttime and the shift's over, and they got this big thing, and they're poking it with their harpoons a little bit, these big chunks of blubber, and it's smoking real black, and they get the black all over their faces, and they're joking, and you can see their teeth laughing through the smoke. It's awesome. It's about like a page-long chapter, the Tri-Works. Like, that's a good example of fiction when it's really working, poetry when it's really working, nonfiction when it's really working. But there's so sometimes, like, you know, you might stand up and read a piece that you really like to your friends. You got to listen to this. And they all listen to it and you all like it. Well, that's a different experience than actually writing the piece that you're talking about. It's a different part of the consciousness. It's a different type of thinking. It's a different type of consciousness. That's what it is, yep. Now, Barfield says that ancient man stood in the center of a wheel of rays like rays, coming to him from the objects of the world.
Guy's name Ray.
Okay? And that, let me see, I'm going to read you a little piece here also from Emerson, whom he quotes in this regard. And they start talking about metaphor, which I'll get to. But so far, you got to admit, this is pretty heavy, right? So far. Okay, Emerson says, "It is easily seen," wrote Emerson, "that there's nothing lucky or capricious in these analogies," talk about metaphors, "but they are constant and pervade nature. Man is an analogist and studies relations in all objects." He's talking about how metaphors are made and how man's standing in the world, surrounded by the natural world. He's placed in the center of beings. An array of relation passes from every other being to him. And neither can man be understood without these objects, nor are these objects without man. All the facts in natural history taken by themselves have no value, but are barren. But marry them to human history, and they are full of life. Because of this radical correspondence between visible things and human thoughts, savages who have only what is necessary converse in figures. As we go back in history, language becomes more picturesque until its infancy, when it is all poetry, or all spiritual facts are represented by natural symbols. So they're saying, like, back in the day, they didn't have abstractions. They didn't have ways of talking about love and freedom and how, they didn't have ways of grouping things. Everything was just what it is. So when they wanted to explain, they had one word for, like, winter, sleep, and death. That was one word. And when it started to evolve and separate itself out, that was a different part, that was the way the consciousness evolved. But when they wanted to explain how winter, sleep, and death came, and how summer, waking, and life came, they told that story about Persephone, and Demeter, and Hades. And they said, yeah, she went down on the ground, and she really did go she's going down on the ground now. That's why it's getting cold and dark early. And she ain't coming back till May, but they probably didn't call it May. So that's the way people thought. Now this is like, this thing up here that says, 3-piece bamboo, 2-piece puff puff, walk around inside, no can see. That's a South Sea Islander's description of a 3-masted, 2-stack steamship. Okay? 3 pieces of bamboo, two chimneys. Once you're inside and you're walking around it, you can't see out. That's not abstract, is it? That's what it's like to go on a steamship. We might think that was kind of poetic, but the person that said it wouldn't think it was poetic. They'd think that's just what it is. So when you have, we were in the taxi with the French cab driver, and we were telling her that French was so musical, which it is. If you listen to it, it's very musical. And she goes, I don't hear any music in there. You know, it sounds just like regular language to me. So that's an important distinction, that it's relative. The poetry of something is relative to the person that's, one person might not think it is, the person that's actually making it might not think it is. This is the thing about the 2 parts of the brain. I know, and the 2 parts of consciousness, the maker part and the appreciator part. Okay, these meanings of the objects were given by nature, but the very nature of their being given was that they could not be at the same time fully apprehended in full regular consciousness. They could not be known, but only experienced or lived. Meanings were single: winter, sleep, death. Barfield draws a parallel to the process of the human individual life. You know, from this kind of development of racial coming to language in history to the way a regular human grows up, where when they're really little, you know, but it's a meaning, you know, when they're very, very real little, the infant may call all men Papa, which has one single meaning, until he learns another few words, and he learns, oh no, that's not, you know, he knows that the other man isn't his father, but that's the only word he has for it. So he says Papa to the postman. You know, that might cause a problem in some family. But basically, when he learns a little more, when he's been in the world a little bit longer, he'll learn some more words. He'll learn, no, that's a man, and that's Papa. One meaning is more particular, and one is more general. But he just have the one word as he grows up, and that's the way we come in. So that, likewise, an early man, they had one word for winter, sleep, and death, and one word for summer, waking up, and being alive. What is poetry to the reader or hearer may not have been poetry to the maker, like the puff thing. Might not, that person that described a ship that way might not think that's poetic at all. That's just description. Inasmuch as man is living the poetry of which he is the maker, and as long as he is so doing, it cannot be poetry to him. He doesn't see it as poetry. In order to appreciate it, he must also exist consciously outside it. For otherwise, the felt change of consciousness cannot come about. So the part of us, the part of me that knows the tri-works is a hell of a fine piece of writing, is not the same part as the part that makes poems. This is the two types of thinking, the creative and the rational. The tree of life, the creative is the tree of life, and the rational is the tree of knowledge. And the tree of life is a lot older. The absolute rational principle is that which makes us conscious of poetry but cannot create it. The absolute poetic principle is that which creates poetry but cannot make one conscious of it. So, more and more, you know, in contemporary life and in our life, the rational principle is how civilization works. You know, if you forget the rational principle, they put you in jail. You do some stuff you're not supposed to do because you're not thinking rationally, and you get in trouble. Okay. And I have this stuff about the individual, the history of the individual. When you don't, Wordsworth, they started getting really into this thing about the rational principle and looking at how the mind works and how the imagination works around the time in Western culture, around the time of the French Revolution. The self-conscious rational mind really took hold around the Romantic period, around the French Revolution. The problematic nature of the imagination, the making explicit of its mystery, And it began to be the chief preoccupation of poets, and even the subject of their poems. Wordsworth's Prelude, Keats, the Ode on Aggression, that's when they started writing poems about making poetry and about, you know, the workings of the mind. And it was before Freud or any of those guys. Wordsworth wrote the Prelude where he's thinking back to when he was a kid. And he says, one need only refer to Wordsworth's theory and poems alike for a full statement of the way in which the child's experience can acquire poetic value when it's remembered by the conscious, full-grown man or woman. The old single living meanings, which the individual splits up as he grows. So when you're a kid, you do have single meanings for things, which the individual splits up as he grows, are allowed to impinge as memory on the adult consciousness, and the result is pure aesthetic experience. And the result is something like the Prelude, or the result is something like when you're writing about when you were a little kid. And then in that way, the child is father to the man. That's what Barfield said. Of course, that's what Wordsworth said, but that's what Barfield thinks he meant by that. Okay. The imagination. So then we talk about the imagination, and that's when they started really doing that. Was during the Romantic period at the end of the 1700s, early 1800s. They started focusing on that, and that's the way poetry went. It was a huge revolution in English poetry. When Wordsworth and Coleridge brought out that little book, the Lyrical Ballads, those guys were in their 20s when they wrote that book. And the principles in the any poetry students in here, you should read that book. And especially the introduction to it, preface to it, because it's a famous poetic manifesto about using regular language, first of all, in terms of poetic diction, and also about the inner self. And they wrote poems that were different than any that had been written that up to then in English. So how do you keep on going then? How does language evolve? Well, it evolves through metaphor. And metaphor is a thing of where the imagination sees likeness in things. It sees things that are alike. And it's Shelley, who was one of those romantics of the younger age, you know, he's the second tier with Keats and Byron, says that the imagination perceives the before unapprehended relation of things into something new, into new meaning. Okay? Well, Barfield would say, when it's a really powerful image, it's a forgotten relation of things. It's a thing like winter, sleep, and death. It's a thing that goes way back to before we had full self-consciousness type of thing. So, I don't know how you give that a test, but, you know, that's probably what those deep image guys were talking about. Or maybe what, I don't know. But that's how you tell if you have a powerful image, is you see likeness in things and you make a wholeness out of them that's a new meaning. And that's what the imagination is always trying to do. It's trying to see wholeness in the world. It's trying to make things whole. It's not trying to split things up. What's trying to split things up is the rational mind, which wants to analyze it and figure it out. And so that's the two types of thinking. By now, it's the imagination which sees the unity between such different elements. By now we're in the modern and postmodern times, and our minds flutter back and forth with great speed from the creative to the imaginative and back again. And we continue to make new meaning from metaphor. So Aristotle, and when it came Aristotle, you know, he was obviously a long time before Coleridge and those guys, but even he thought that metaphor was the coolest thing. The making of metaphors is by far the most important, since this alone does not involve borrowing from somebody else and is therefore a mark of genius. For to make a good metaphor is to contemplate likeness, to see likeness in the world. likeness happens in fiction too. It happens in poetry, obviously. You know, the sublime genre. I mean, what can I say? But it happens in fiction too. And we see it with, you know, a crazy guy getting on a ship and going out after a white whale with people from all different parts of the globe, Eastern and Western, on the ship. And there they're going. You know, that's a metaphor. Right? That's a big metaphor. I mean, so our challenge as writers in this time that we're in is to find a way to escape the rational and allow the imagination, allow the tree of life, allow the part of us that makes things to come forward. One way to do this is to practice a regular schedule. You know, a regular sitting down schedule. Here's where I go to write my stuff. And this is what time I go there. And this is how I do it. And I turn on the lamp and I sit down and I disconnect the phone. I turn off my stuff and I sit there. I don't check my email. I do it every time. I do it every time. Bill Cosby go like using a razor. I use it every time. So you go there, you know, you turn it on, you sit down there. Okay, eventually the rhythm of that will come into you, and rhythm is a thing that is connected to the conscious and the unconscious, connected to the tree of life and the tree of reason. Also, the other thing is, sometimes you're going to sit there and you're going to be so freaking bored that something will shake loose. You just start doing something. You can't help it. You've got to sit there an hour. You look at the clock. You don't get up till the hour's up. Okay, when we do this and you get bored, and bored works, just because you're bored is no excuse. Just because you're not feeling it, that's no excuse. Most of the time, you ain't feeling it. Because you're in the tree of knowledge. You're self-conscious. You've been to counseling. So, you know, you can't count on it. You got to be feeling it. They screwed up our feelings. You know, we got to just, you sit down there anyway, bored or not, and start writing down. If you don't know what else to do, take a big knife and put it on the table, look at that, write something about that. If that doesn't work, take a big spoon. Okay. When this happens, and we become, and we eventually wear ourselves down by doing this practice, I'm telling you, write stuff here, you guys. Nothing that you're going to learn in your time here is as valuable as you developing a regular writing practice. That's better than anything anybody can say. That's the best there is. That makes you a writer. So you go, okay, here's my stuff, and you get that familiar feeling. Here I am. I got my notebook open. Okay, I'm here. And the reason you get it like that, it's like working in a ball glove. It's because you've been working it. So you're used to sitting down there. When this happens, from time to time, we become permeable to the objects of the world. You know, the knife will start to talk to you. Or to the characters, if you're fiction, to the characters and voices of the world. You know, so you start to hear these weird voices these cats listen to. I mean, I think it's weird, but nonetheless, they write stuff about it. And, you know, and it's compelling. We read it and we're compelled by it. Compelled by Ahab. Compelled. We become permeable. And if you're a nonfiction writer, you become permeable to memory. Your memories start talking to you. All of a sudden, they come up alive inside you, and you remember the 6th grade. You remember that you can write. We become permeable mediums, and our rational mind backs off a little bit and lets us come out to play. So that's, I'm sure you'll agree, a brilliant insight on my part. And with that, I'd like to turn to this to this poem by Robert Hayden called "Those Winter Sundays." Sundays, too, my father got up early and put his clothes on in the blue-black cold. Then, with cracked hands that ached from labor in the weekday weather, made banked fires blaze. No one ever thanked him. I'd wake and hear the cold, splintering, breaking. When the rooms were warm, he'd call, and slowly I would rise and dress, fearing the chronic angers of that house, speaking indifferently to him who had driven out the cold and polished my good shoes as well. What did I know of love's austere and lonely offices? So this is a great poem, obviously, and it's great for a lot of reasons, particularly the sound, you know, the crack, the K's and the breaking and the breakingness of it at the beginning. I hear the cold, splintering, breaking. But what's really great about it to me is the choice of the word offices. As though love has, first of all, the hierarchy of an office. It's an office that we can occupy when we rise to its level, which the father is doing in this poem. And it's not an office that you occupy by talking about it, obviously. Because the father is making a fire in the cold, and then he's polishing shoes, and then he's calling out, okay, come down, to the younger one in the house. And I mean, as I say, this is what you read poems like this, and you just think, man, I'll never write anything as good as this. And but we can see that word choice and what power it has, and so that's out. Permeability to his memory. Okay, the next one is by Tess Gallagher. This poem is from Moon Crossing Bridge. It's the first poem in the book. It's a poem that came out right after her husband, Raymond Carver, the great Ray Carver, passed away. And you can't get much more permeable than what the state that's being described here, called Yes. He's saying yes to his death. Now we are like that flat cone of sand in the garden of the silver pavilion in Kyoto, designed to appear only in moonlight. Do you want me to mourn? Do you want me to wear black? Or like moonlight on whitest sand, to use your dark, to gleam, to shimmer? I gleam, I mourn. Oh, man. She said that after he passed on, in their house in Port Angeles, she got up on the bed with him and laid on the bed with him for a couple, 3 days before she called anybody. And this next one is actually like a thing about permeability and origins. The Knot, that by Stanley Kunitz, the great Stanley Kunitz. I've tried to seal it in, that cross-grained knot on the opposite wall, scored in the lintel of my door, but it keeps bleeding through into the world we share. Mornings when I wake, curled in my web, I hear it come with a rush of resin out of the trauma of its lopping off. Obstinate bud, sticky with life, mad for the rain again. It racks itself with shoots that crackle overhead, dividing as they grow. Let be, let be. I shake my wings and fly into its boughs. Kunitz. So he sees the knot turn back into a tree, and he becomes a bird in the grip of his imagination. And it says, you know, obstinate, you know, I mean, you'd think he'd want to make a second stanza out of it. Obstinate bud, starting there, he'd make a new stanza, but he doesn't. It's all one thing to him. You know, mad for the rain again. It racks itself with shoots that crackle overhead. I hear it come with a rush of resin. He's a medium. He's hearing stuff. Now really, it's a knot on the wall that's, you know, come through the paint. And he's looking at it again. And he's going, I hear it come with a rush of resin. He's turned himself into a medium. Okay, we got Ruth Stone. Next, Currents. I may have brought this poem up here before, but if I have, it deserves a second reading. Something about a flock of birds toward evening, the weather report, sleet, snow, the hot males riding ahead, the swamp ridged in last year's cattails, ego, vanity, the males strut. Oh, that burr and sweetest whistle, their hearts pumped with thrush steroids. In another week, perhaps a quick melt, and we'll hear them clinging to the old stalks, staking out their claims, while from the south, the slow shadow of the migrating females, like Cleopatra's barge, the oars dipping, the fringed canopy, like clouds of sweet rain rippling behind. The eternal tribal ritual, the dense flock undulating, packet of the future, great sperm bank of the galaxy, the billions of the separate that gathers itself into the one, summer after summer. You know, a poem like this, you can see all the way back to the beginning, right? You can see Ruth Stone, you can see all the way back to the beginning. Ruth Stone sometimes would think that she could hear planetary voices talking to her. And when she would run into the house to write it down. That's how the way a lot of her poems came to her. I don't know about this one. But it's so wonderful. I mean, you read a little bit of it, and you know you're in like spring in New England or somewhere, that's where she lives. And you know you're kind of listening to a woman's voice, you know, ego, vanity, the male strut. Mostly we don't talk about how we got ego and vanity because we don't like to admit that. Or, you know, we feel like that goes better unsaid or something. But you can tell it's, you know, and then, but instead though of of there being any, then she follows it by saying that burr and sweetest whistle, their hearts pumped with thrush steroids. You think this is like a nature poem until you see a word like steroids. Ego, vanity, the male, the thrush steroids. In another week, perhaps a quick melt, and we'll hear them clinging to the old stalks. That's great, isn't it? It's like they're going back to the stations. That's where they go. That's where they went back when they were writing, before we needed similes and metaphors. That's where those birds went. So, Ruth Stone, totally awesome writer. All of you should have a book by Ruth Stone. You should have a book by Ruth Stone if you write fiction, nonfiction, poetry. One book by Ruth Stone.
This right here. It's just gorgeous.
And then the last one I have here is from the sonneteer Henri Kolb, called Mechanical Soft. It's from his book Touch. Walking yesterday in the cold, bright air, I encountered 15 horses marching in a phalanx down the avenue. Long before they were visible, I heard their shoes striking the pavement, as language is sometimes audible before sense arrives. I loved how the wind played with their long brushed tails, though in a faraway place I was not a stranger. Mother is dying, you see, and proximity to this death makes me nostalgic for the French language. I am not a typical son, I suppose, valuing happiness, even while spooning mechanically soft pears, like light vanishing into the body whose tissue once dissolved to create breast milk for me. So, when you look at this poem, my wife likes that word played, and she's right, because you hear these shoes striking, you have this phalanx, you have this kind of almost military, certainly mechanical sound, and then the wind played with their long brushed tails. And then he has this little sort of scene setting, though I'm in a faraway place, I'm not a stranger, mother is dying, you see. And proximity to this death makes me nostalgic for the French language. Proximity, you go to see your parent die, you're not a stranger there. And then, again, I was not, I am not a typical son, I suppose. So he works repetition in this. Repetition's great. It's great for any kind of writing. It's great for fiction too. It's great for prose. It's great for memoir. It's great especially for poetry. I am not, I was not. You don't even realize that the writer's doing this kind of stuff when you read a piece like this. You just know this is quiet and still, and it's something about it that soothes the mind. I'm not a typical son, I suppose, valuing happiness, even while spooning. Like, I want to be happy. Probably not a typical son. Maybe I should be valuing sadness, but I'm valuing happiness. Even while spooning mechanically soft pears, like light vanishing into the body whose tissue once dissolved. That's a word, right? Dissolved. This body whose tissue once dissolved to create breast milk for me. I didn't know that's what happened when women lactate, and maybe it isn't exactly, but I believe it when I read this, and I think of the great maternal sacrifice that is being honored in this poem. And even in spite of the fact that the one who's speaking it says, I value happiness, I'm not a typical son. You get the feeling he doesn't live with his mom, he's not used to being there. And so that's Henri Cole, and that's his diction that I think sets this poem apart from other sonnets that we may have read and not admired so much. Now that's really all I got for you guys this morning. I know I was kind of like clumsy about this because it's hard for me to figure out exactly what this guy was talking about all the time. But the one thing I did get out of it was it's a different part of us that wants to read the poem and enjoy the poem, and it's going through like in the second part of, it's a different part of us than the part that makes the poem. The part that makes the poem is not entirely rational, and we don't ever want to make it rational. So that's the deal. Thanks a lot. See you later.